The morning of the 14th of September began with a relentless, driving rain that turned the London streets into a grey, slick labyrinth. At 221 B. Baker Street, the fire was a welcome, if feeble, defence against the damp chill that had managed to penetrate our walls. I was occupied with a medical journal, enjoying the rare, tranquil silence of a morning without a pressing case, when Sherlock Holmes abruptly abandoned his microscope, his movements sharp and impatient. "Watson," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade, "there is a fundamental dishonesty in the way the morning papers characterize the perfect crime. They look for the grand gesture, the dramatic flourish, but the most profound deviations from the truth are usually found in the small, stuttering failures of the mundane." I looked up, accustomed to his sudden philosophical outbursts. "Is there news of some disturbance, then?" "There is news of an impossibility," Holmes replied, pacing the rug with restless energy. "A report has reached Scotland Yard regarding the 8:15 express from Dover. A passenger was observed boarding in a hurry, drenched, without a ticket, and clearly agitated. He vanished into a first-class compartment, and yet when the ticket collector reached the carriage 3 stops later, the compartment was locked from the inside, the window was latched, and the passenger had simply ceased to exist." I set my journal aside, the absurdity of the claim immediately piquing my professional curiosity. A locked room mystery on a moving train. Surely, Holmes, the man simply jumped from the carriage while it was in motion, at 40 miles an hour in a thunderstorm, through a window that was found painted shut with layers of decades-old grime. "I think not, Watson." The inspector assigned to the case, a man of limited imagination, is currently convinced that the witness was suffering from a hallucination brought on by the atmospheric pressure of the storm. Holmes stopped by the window, his eyes narrowed as he watched the rain lash against the glass. "I have no patience for dismissive explanations that ignore the physical reality of the situation. The ticket collector, a man named Halloway, is a person of reliable character, and he insists that he saw a man enter that carriage with his own eyes. Furthermore, a fine, metallic dust, a residue, I suspect, is linked to the industrial machinery of the Dover yards, was found on the velvet upholstery of the seat. A man who was never there does not leave behind a chemical signature." He turned to me, his expression suddenly intense and focused. "We are going to Victoria Station, Watson. The train is currently being held on a siding, and while Lestrade is busy interrogating the staff, I intend to see what the carriage itself has to say. It is a puzzle that requires not just intuition, but the cold, hard logic of the physical sciences." I rose to gather my coat, realizing that the quiet morning I had anticipated was thoroughly extinguished. "You believe the man was killed?" "I believe the man was moved," Holmes corrected, reaching for his Inverness cape. "And I believe that whoever orchestrated his disappearance possessed a knowledge of the railway's internal workings that is far more sophisticated than the average criminal could ever hope to attain. We are dealing with a ghost, Watson, but ghosts, as I have always maintained, are merely phenomena we have yet to categorize." We stepped out into the rain, the city a blur of wet stone and dark, rushing water. As we made our way toward the station, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that we were not merely investigating a vanishing act, but were walking into the center of a web that had been spun with an agonizing, meticulous precision. The 8:15 express stood silent and imposing on the siding, its iron flank gleaming with the cold, wet reality of the storm, and as we approached the platform, I knew that the mystery of the passenger who never paid was only the first, ominous note in a far more dangerous, dissonant melody. The interior of the railway carriage felt like a tomb, heavy with the stale scent of coal smoke and the cold, damp misery of the morning rain. As we stepped into the first-class compartment, the silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic, mournful tapping of the downpour against the windowpane. Holmes did not immediately speak. He moved with the clinical, practiced grace of an entomologist, his eyes scanning every square inch of the upholstery, the floorboards, and the ornate polished wood of the paneling. He produced his magnifying lens, the glass catching the dim, grey light of the platform, and began to trace the path he believed the passenger had taken. I stood in the corridor, feeling entirely superfluous, my own eyes darting toward the latched windows and the securely locked door of the compartment. It was, as the inspector had insisted, a complete impossibility. There was no secret panel, no hidden catch, and the structural integrity of the carriage remained entirely uncompromised. The man had simply entered the compartment, and in the intervening minutes of the journey, he had ceased to exist within the physical confines of the train. Holmes stopped suddenly, his focus locking upon the small, decorative molding just beneath the ceiling. He used a specialized, delicate probe to gently nudge a microscopic speck of debris that had been lodged in the crevice of the wood. Using his tweezers, he retrieved a tiny, jagged piece of what appeared to be blue-dyed wool, a fragment so minute it would have been dismissed as dust by any other investigator. He held it up to the light, a faint, wolfish smile touching his lips. It was not the only anomaly. He pointed out to me that the heavy velvet curtains on the window had been rehung with a subtle, minute degree of inaccuracy. To an untrained eye, they appeared perfectly level, but to Holmes, the discrepancy, a matter of a mere quarter-inch, was a beacon of deliberate, calculated manipulation. He whispered to me that the window had not been painted shut by time, but had been intentionally sealed from the inside, using a quick-drying, industrial-grade adhesive that was currently invisible to the casual observer. The man had not vanished, he had been removed, and the carriage had been meticulously restored to suggest a mystery, where, in truth, there was only a very deliberate, very cold-blooded crime. I looked at the window with a newfound, chilling realization. If the window had been sealed from the inside, the perpetrator must have been within the carriage at the moment of the disappearance, or they had somehow managed to execute the maneuver while the train was in transit, despite the physical impossibility of the task. Holmes moved toward the door, his eyes scanning the floorboards for the faint, scuffed marks that would indicate the shifting of heavy furniture. Yet the floor remained pristine. He knelt, his fingers tracing the edge of the carpet, and detected a faint, localized depression in the floorboards, a sign that something heavy, perhaps a trapdoor or a hidden mechanical egress, had been recently, if skillfully, reset. He told me that the entire floor of the carriage had been designed with a modularity that allowed for the removal of the paneling, a feature that was likely original to the construction of the train, but had been modified for a far more sinister, clandestine purpose. The passenger had not walked off the train. He had been pulled through the floor, a piece of prey swallowed by the very mechanism he had trusted to carry him to safety. The revelation hit me with the weight of a physical blow. The railway company, the very symbol of industrial progress and secure, reliable transit, had been turned into an instrument of murder, its hidden, structural secrets exploited by a mind of frightening, systemic intelligence. Holmes stood, his face set in a grim, hard line, and told me that our investigation was no longer about the passenger who never paid, but about the network of individuals who had designed this train to act as a mobile, undetectable slaughterhouse. He instructed me to watch the platform for any sign of the railway officials who had been involved in the carriage's maintenance, specifically looking for anyone who displayed the signs of nervous, hurried preoccupation. We had identified the how and the where, but the who remained a shadow, a presence that moved within the bowels of the station with the freedom of a man who owned the very tracks upon which we stood. I felt a cold, deep, and abiding dread, the realization that we were not merely chasing a killer, we were challenging a conspiracy that possessed the resources to hide its crimes in plain sight, protected by the very institution it sought to subvert. As we exited the carriage, the rain continued to lash the station, the damp, grey light casting long, distorted shadows across the platform. Holmes moved toward the station master's office, his pace brisk and determined, his mind clearly already engaged in the intricate, multi-layered architecture of the next inevitable move. He told me that he would require me to secure a list of all maintenance workers who had been assigned to the 8:15 Express over the past month, paying particular attention to those with a background in structural engineering or high-level mechanical repair. The evidence of the blue wool and the adhesive was only the first, vital spark in a much larger, more volatile powder keg. As I watched him, I felt an overwhelming sense of admiration for the sheer, unrelenting focus he brought to a problem that would have paralyzed any other man's. He was the eye of the storm, a singular, brilliant point of clarity in a city that was rapidly descending into the chaos of a high-stakes, industrial nightmare. The case of the missing passenger was no longer a question of impossibility, but a question of time before the truth was forced to reveal its hidden, unvarnished face. We were on the precipice of a scandal that would tear the facade of the railway system asunder, and the only thing standing between the truth and the abyss was the singular, uncompromising intellect of the man currently turning his collar against the wind, his eyes already fixed upon the next inevitable step in his grand, logical design. The investigation into the railway maintenance staff was a tedious, mind-numbing exercise that tested my limited patience. Yet Holmes threw himself into the task with the relentless, unsparing focus of a man possessed. We spent the better part of the following 2 days in the drafty, echoing archives of the Southeastern Railway, our fingers stained with the soot of centuries of industrial record keeping. Holmes, despite his previous uncharitable comments regarding the incompetence of the railway officials, was a master of his own presentation within these bureaucratic halls. He posed as a consultant tasked with the modernization of the station's safety protocols, an act of deception so flawless that the chief clerks were all too eager to provide him with access to the most restricted files. I meticulously cross-referenced the maintenance rosters, looking for any name that appeared with suspicious, recurring frequency on the logs for the 8:15 Express. It was a monotonous, soul-dampening labor, yet as the hours bled into days, a pattern began to emerge from the dense, repetitive columns of dates and duties. A single name, one Arthur Pendergast, appeared as the primary engineer for every instance of, as the logs cryptically put it, internal structural adjustment performed on the carriages that housed the first-class compartments. Holmes leaned over my shoulder, his finger tracing the line of ink until it rested firmly upon the name. He told me that Pendergast was not merely a railway technician, but a man of considerable, specialized skill whose career had been marked by a sudden, inexplicable departure from the service of the Royal Navy's Torpedo Engineering Division. It was a detail so specific, so perfectly aligned with the type of structural tampering we had observed, that it nearly confirmed our suspicion in one fell swoop. Pendergast possessed the unique, sophisticated knowledge required to install a silent, mechanical trapdoor system without alerting the inspectors, and he clearly maintained the clandestine, financial backing to ensure that his work remained hidden from the railway's central oversight. We left the archives just as the evening commute began, the station transformed into a chaotic, streaming river of humanity, the noise and the motion, a sharp, jarring contrast to the cold, analytical stillness we had just inhabited. Holmes told me that we needed to find Pendergast's residence immediately, as the window of time we had to secure the evidence of his mechanical modifications was closing rapidly, likely before he could attempt a permanent, irrevocable concealment of his work. The journey to Pendergast's residence in the industrial heart of Bermondsey was a descent into the soot-stained, forgotten corners of the city, where the air was thick with the harsh, pungent tang of coal gas and the relentless mechanical heartbeat of the nearby ironworks. The house was a narrow, brooding structure that seemed to shrink away from the light of the nearby gas lamps, its windows dark and inscrutable. Holmes approached the door with a quiet, practiced caution, his hand resting on the handle of his walking stick. We did not wait for an invitation. He breached the lock with an effortless, almost bored efficiency, and we stepped into a space that was the very antithesis of the opulent, first-class carriage we had examined. The room was a workshop, a claustrophobic, intense space filled with the tools of a master engineer, precision calipers, fine-grained files, and several detailed cross-section blueprints of the very carriage we had investigated. It was a repository of secret, mechanical intent, the room's existence, a silent, damning indictment of Pendergast's involvement in the disappearance of the passenger. I felt a surge of triumph. The evidence we had been hunting laid out before us with a clarity that seemed almost divine. Yet Holmes remained focused, his eyes scanning the workshop for the one final missing piece of the puzzle. He discovered it tucked behind a row of heavy iron-bound chests, a ledger bound in worn grease, stained leather containing the names, dates, and, most chillingly, the payments made for each instance of carriage adjustment. The list was not a roster of criminal associates, but a record of high-level political figures who had clearly utilized a train as a clandestine, undetectable method of removing individuals who had become a liability to their interests. The passenger from the 8:15 Express was not a victim of a random opportunistic crime, but a calculated, state-sanctioned disappearance. I felt a sudden, profound chill run through me, the realization that we were not merely investigating a murder, but a shadow operation that operated under the implicit, protected consent of the very authorities who were currently overseeing the investigations. The stakes were no longer a local railway-based mystery. They were a question of national security, and the danger we were currently in had just magnified by an order of magnitude. Holmes closed the ledger, his face a study in grim, analytical satisfaction. He told me that we had secured the evidence required to initiate a far more significant national inquiry. But we were currently the only two people in London who knew the true, terrifying extent of the conspiracy. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with a fierce, unwavering light. He reminded me that the railway authorities, the police, and the conspirators themselves would soon realize that their secret had been breached. We had to move with an absolute, uncompromising urgency, yet we had to ensure that the ledger reached the hands of an official who was not yet compromised by the conspirators. He began to organize the tools we had found, his mind already mapping the logistical, multi-layered variables of the next, inevitable move. As we exited the workshop, the distant, muffled sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed through the alleyway, a warning that the shadow operators were already closing the circle. I realized that the mystery of the passenger had been, in truth, a test of our resolve, and as we moved into the dark, rain-streaked night, I knew that the morning would bring us face to face with a truth that had been waiting for a long, dangerous time to finally be unmasked, regardless of the cost. Good night to our listeners of Baker Street Enigma. The city is vast, the shadows are long, and the truth is always waiting for someone with the courage to walk through the door. The echoes of the heavy, rhythmic footsteps in the alleyway behind Pendergast's workshop served as an urgent, violent punctuation to our discovery. We did not wait to confront the approaching shadow. Operators, Holmes, with a fluid, practiced motion, extinguished our lantern and signaled for me to follow him into the narrow, labyrinthine passage that connected the workshop to the main thoroughfare. We moved with the desperate, silent speed of men who understood that the game had shifted from an intellectual pursuit to a physical, life-and-death evasion. The industrial district of Bermondsey was a suffocating maze of iron fences, coal, dust-choked alleyways, and the constant, oppressive hum of the distant ironworks, providing both a cover of darkness and a minefield of potential traps. We navigated the darkness with a steady, calculated resolve, our path dictated by Holmes's internal, unerring map of the city's forgotten architecture. As we finally emerged onto the comparative safety of a broader gas-lit street, he stopped, his chest heaving slightly, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. He told me that we had successfully extracted the ledger, but we were now the primary targets of an organization that possessed the resources to exert influence across every level of the capital's infrastructure. He pulled the leather-bound ledger from his coat, its surface cold and damp from the night air, and insisted that we move immediately to the residence of a contact he had maintained within the Metropolitan Records Office, a man named Abernathy, whose loyalty was one of the few immutable constants in the volatile, unpredictable world of our inquiries. We hired a passing hansom cab, the driver's eyes sliding past us with a practiced, cynical indifference that served as our best initial defense. As we rattled through the dark, rain-streaked streets, Holmes began to outline the implications of the ledger's contents. He explained that the disappearance of the passenger on the 8:15 express was part of a larger, systemic effort to purge the ranks of the railway's independent, whistle-blowing engineers who had begun to document the pervasive, top-down corruption within the transit ministry. The conspirators were not merely removing individuals, they were systematically pruning the organization of anyone who posed an intellectual or moral threat to their control. The passenger, as it turned out, had been an assistant to a high-ranking naval architect who had discovered the railway was being used for the illicit transport of military-grade munitions to private, offshore agents. My heart hammered against my ribs as the magnitude of his deduction crystallized. We were not merely chasing a killer, we were standing in the path of a deep, entrenched corruption that had the potential to ignite an international diplomatic crisis if the news of the munitions transport reached the foreign press. Holmes's ability to weave these seemingly disparate, cold facts into a cohesive, damning narrative was, as always, a testament to his singular, uncompromising brilliance. He insisted that our only path forward was to present the ledger to the Admiralty Board, bypassing the standard, easily compromised channels of the police entirely. It was a gamble of immense, terrifying scale, for the Admiralty Board itself was rumored to have been infiltrated by the very individuals we were currently exposing. Yet, as the cab turned into the quiet, tree-lined street where Abernathy lived, I felt a strange, enduring sense of clarity. We were the only ones who possessed the evidence, and we were the only ones with the resolve to deliver it to the one place where the truth could no longer be ignored. Abernathy's residence was a quiet, modest house, the windows dark save for a single, warm flicker of light emanating from the study. We knocked with a measured, coded rhythm that I had learned long ago, and after a tense, agonized moment, the door opened, revealing a man whose features were etched with the exhaustion of a lifelong, bureaucratic struggle. He recognized Holmes instantly, his surprise quickly giving way to a profound, guarded concern as he ushered us inside. We wasted no time in presenting the ledger. As Abernathy scanned its contents, the color drained from his face, his hands beginning to shake with the visceral, honest fear of a man who suddenly realized the depth of the precipice upon which he stood. He confirmed that the names on the list were indeed those of the most influential, untouchable men in the government, and that the railway network was, in truth, an instrument of their clandestine, private operations. He agreed, with a trembling, solemn resolve, to act as our intermediary to the Admiralty, pledging to secure an emergency, closed-door audience for the following morning. As we sat in the quiet, pressurized atmosphere of Abernathy's study, the gravity of the situation pressed down upon us like the atmosphere before a massive storm. Holmes remained entirely composed, his presence a stabilizing, cool, and logical anchor in a world that felt as though it were fraying at the edges. He sat at the desk, his eyes fixed on a map of the railway's underground infrastructure, his mind already beginning to anticipate the countermoves that the conspirators would undoubtedly launch the moment they discovered the ledger had been compromised. I looked at my friend, the consulting detective who had become the silent, watchful axis upon which our world turned, and felt a profound, enduring gratitude for the life we had shared in all its complexity and danger. We had moved from the quiet intellectual vacuum of Baker Street to the heart of a national conspiracy. Through it all, the singular, unwavering focus of his mind had been our guide. As Abernathy locked the study door, the quiet, protective silence of the room a temporary fragile sanctuary, I knew that the morning would bring us face to face with a truth that had been waiting for a long, dangerous time to finally be unmasked, regardless of the cost. Good night to our listeners of Baker Street Enigma. The city is vast, the shadows are long, and the truth is always waiting for someone with the courage to walk through the door. Stay sharp, stay vigilant, and remember that when the world seems most incomprehensible, the truth is merely the next, inevitable step in the long, meticulous process of deduction. The morning arrived with a thin, bruised light that barely penetrated the heavy curtains of Abernathy's study. I had spent the night in a state of fitful, shallow sleep, my thoughts repeatedly circling the implications of the ledger and the lethal shadow network we had so audaciously challenged. Holmes, however, remained seated exactly as he had been when we arrived, his eyes fixed on the map of the railway's subterranean tunnels, his posture relaxed yet radiating an intensity that made the very air in the room feel charged. He had not slept, nor had he shown the slightest inclination to do so. He was merely waiting, his mind already 3 steps ahead of the conspirators' inevitable reaction. When Abernathy finally emerged from the hallway, his face was pale and drawn, but his resolve had hardened into a cold, professional necessity. He informed us that the emergency audience with the Admiralty had been secured, though it was to be held at an unconventional, high-security location, a private research facility on the banks of the Thames, away from the prying eyes of the main administrative officers. It was a clear indication that the conspirators had not yet realized the full extent of the ledger's compromise, or, more likely, that the Admiralty Board was attempting to isolate the investigation from the reach of the Ministry's internal intelligence apparatus. We travelled to the facility in a black, unmarked carriage, the streets of London appearing eerily deserted in the early pre-dawn silence. The city seemed to be holding its breath, the ordinary, mundane pulse of the morning not yet begun, leaving us to navigate a landscape that felt stripped of its familiar, reassuring reality. As we approached the facility, a sprawling, Victorian-era structure that loomed over the river like a fortress, I felt the familiar, bracing surge of anticipation. Holmes checked his watch, his movements precise and economical, then looked at me, a brief, silent confirmation of our purpose, before we descended into the cold, damp morning air. The security guards at the facility were of a different breed than the railway staff. They moved with the disciplined, lethal grace of men who had seen real conflict, their eyes tracking our every movement with a cold, professional assessment. We were ushered into a high-ceilinged, sterile chamber where 3 men in the uniform of the Admiralty sat at a long mahogany table, their faces obscured by the shadows and the dim, flickering glow of a single, central lamp. The leader of the group, a man with a stern, angular face and the piercing eyes of a hawk, gestured for us to sit. He did not waste time with pleasantries or the standard, bureaucratic rituals of introduction. He demanded that we present the ledger immediately, his tone sharp and demanding. Holmes placed the worn, grease-stained volume upon the table, his movements deliberate, his expression one of absolute unwavering confidence. As the leader opened the ledger, the silence in the chamber became profound, the only sound the rustle of the pages as he meticulously scrutinized the damning, incriminating details of the railway's shadow operations. I watched his face, expecting to see shock or indignation, yet his features remained a mask of cold, unreadable calculation. He turned the pages, his eyes darting across the names and the dates, and it was only when he reached the final, documented instance of the munitions transport that his hand faltered, his expression finally yielding to a trace of genuine startled alarm. It was the confirmation we had been waiting for. The Admiralty Board had been aware of the railway's internal problems, but they had been entirely ignorant of the scale and the high-level political depth of the conspiracy. He closed the ledger and looked at Holmes, his eyes narrowed with a complex mixture of professional respect and deep, lingering suspicion. He asked for our assessment of the situation, to which Holmes responded with a brief, articulate, and devastatingly logical account of the railway's subversion, emphasizing the necessity of an immediate total purge of the Transit Ministry's current, compromised leadership. The leader listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving Holmes's face, his mind clearly assessing the political fallout and the absolute existential threat this information posed to the current administration. He informed us that the evidence was sufficient to justify a secret, sweeping arrest of the individuals involved, but that the process would have to be conducted with the utmost suffocating discretion to avoid triggering a broader international incident. We were effectively dismissed, instructed to return to our lodgings and await further instructions, yet the implication was clear: we had successfully delivered the truth into the hands of those who possessed the power to act, even if their actions would likely occur in the dark, away from the scrutiny of the public eye. As we exited the facility and stepped back into the carriage, the sun was finally beginning to crest over the skyline, casting long, pale rays of light across the river. The weight that had pressed against my lungs for the past 2 days finally began to dissipate, replaced by a profound, hollow sense of relief. Holmes leaned back, his eyes closing, his breathing slowing as the adrenaline of the mission finally began to wane. He commented, with a faint, weary smile, that the truth is rarely a clean or satisfying conclusion. It is, more often than not, a series of uncomfortable realities that the world must eventually learn to accommodate, whether it chooses to or not. He seemed entirely satisfied with the outcome, the singular analytical puzzle of the missing passenger and the railway subversion now effectively solved, his mind already beginning to retreat into the quiet, analytical sanctuary of his own personal interests. We had served the state, we had exposed the shadow operators, and we had preserved the fragile, underlying order of the city, and for a man of his singular, uncompromising focus, that was the only outcome that mattered. The carriage rattled toward Baker Street, the streets finally beginning to wake up, the ordinary, bustling chaos of London returning to its familiar rhythmic pulse. The case of the 8:15 passenger was formally filed, the ledger was safely in the hands of the Admiralty, and the potential scandal was being expertly, silently, managed by those who knew how to operate in the grey, murky spaces of the government. I looked at my friend, the consulting detective who had become the silent, watchful axis upon which our world turned, and felt a profound, enduring gratitude for the life we had shared, in all its complexity and danger. We had moved from the cold, industrial archives to the heart of a national conspiracy, and through it all, the singular, unwavering focus of his mind had been our guide. As we pulled up to our rooms, the quiet, inviting glow of the gaslight beckoning us inside, I knew that tomorrow would bring a new, unfolding mystery. But today, the ledger was closed. Good night to our listeners of Baker Street Enigma. The world remains a complicated, often dangerous place. But tonight, the truth has been served, the corruption unmasked, and the order of things has been, for the moment, restored. Stay sharp, stay vigilant, and remember that when the world seems most incomprehensible, the truth is merely the next, inevitable step in the long, meticulous process of deduction. The quiet of Baker Street was a profound, almost jarring contrast to the tension of the preceding days. Yet it was a stillness I found myself deeply grateful for. Holmes had returned to his familiar obsessive rhythm, his sitting room once again transformed into a repository of disparate, seemingly unrelated information, notes on the railway's mechanical schematics, detailed accounts of the Admiralty's secret logistics, and a collection of linguistic charts relating to the cipher we had intercepted. He moved through the space with the deliberate, calm efficiency of a man who had successfully partitioned his experience and was now free to return to the pure intellectual pursuit of his next, as yet unseen mystery. I sat by the window, watching the rain, a persistent grey drizzle, transformed the city into a blurred, impressionistic landscape. It was a day for reflection, a day to process the sheer, staggering scale of the conspiracy we had been forced to confront, and to appreciate the singular, uncompromising nature of the man who had been our guide through the industrial underworld. Holmes did not speak for several hours, his focus absolute, his pen scratching against the parchment in a steady, monotonous drone. It was only when the evening gaslight began to flicker in the street that he finally pushed his papers aside and allowed himself a brief, rare moment of relaxation. He poured himself a glass of sherry, his movements slow and measured. He looked toward the fireplace, his eyes reflective and uncharacteristically soft. He observed that the case of the passenger who never paid was not merely a matter of tracking a criminal, but of navigating the systemic rot that could infect even the most robust and essential institutions of the state. The railway, he argued, was intended to be the great democratic conduit of progress, yet it had been subverted by the very individuals tasked with its protection. It was a classic demonstration of the corruption that occurs when the mechanisms of power are allowed to operate in the absence of transparency and the absolute unblinking light of public accountability. I asked him if he believed that the Admiralty's involvement would lead to a genuine, lasting transformation of the Transit Ministry, or if the case would simply be buried and forgotten in the vast labyrinthine archives of the government. Holmes allowed a small, wry smile to touch his lips, his gaze passing back to the fire. He remarked that the truth, once uncovered, possesses a persistent, radioactive quality that makes it difficult to entirely suppress. Whether the Admiralty acted with total transparency or chose to manage the fallout with the characteristic, state-sanctioned discretion of their office, the existence of the ledger had fundamentally altered the reality of the conspirators. They could no longer operate with the absolute unquestioned impunity they had enjoyed for so long, and that, in and of itself, was a victory of the most significant logical order. He was a realist, a man who understood that the world is a complex, often imperfect machine. Yet he remained fundamentally committed to the belief that the application of pure objective reason could, and must, continue to hold the shadow operators to account. We were interrupted by the arrival of the Evening Post, which contained a cryptic, unsigned note that had been left at our doors. It was a brief, simple message, a single, hand-drawn symbol that Holmes recognized instantly as the mark of a specific clandestine group of informants he had cultivated in the docks of the East End. He read the note once, his expression sharpening into a look of focused, immediate intent. He did not explain the content, but his reaction was a clear, unmistakable signal that our period of enforced domesticity was coming to a premature end. He stood and began to organize his coat and hat, his eyes already fixed on the next, looming possibility of his work. I did not ask for clarification, for I knew the nature of our lives, that no matter how far we traveled or how intricate the mystery, we would always be pulled back into the relentless, forward-moving trajectory of his investigation. We were once again the silent, watchful sentinels of the truth, waiting for the shadows to move and the questions to be asked. As we climbed into a hansom cab, the city outside once again beckoned with the promise of the unknown. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a cold, damp stillness that felt almost expectant, as if the city itself were holding its breath, awaiting our next logical intervention. The case of the 8:15 passenger was already beginning to fade in his memory, relegated to the same meticulous index files as the many other intricate mysteries we had encountered. He was a man who lived in the present, a man whose existence was defined by the singular, unyielding focus he brought to the immediate, unfolding problem. I watched his profile, the sharp, intelligent features etched in the flickering light of the passing gas lamps, and felt a profound, enduring sense of duty to the work we shared. We had navigated the complexities of the industrial underworld and the corruption of the state, and through it all, the singular, unwavering focus of his mind had been our guide. As we reached the dark, labyrinthine maze of the East End docks, the smell of brine and tar filling the air, I knew that whatever we were about to enter, it would be met by the same singular, uncompromising focus that defined our lives. Good night, Baker Street Enigma listeners. The world remains a complicated, often dangerous place, but tonight the truth has been served, the corruption unmasked, and the order of things has been, for the moment, restored. Stay sharp, stay vigilant, and remember that when the world seems most incomprehensible, the truth is merely the next inevitable step in the long, meticulous process of deduction. The city will awaken tomorrow to a new set of complications, a new weave of secrets, and a new unfolding series of events. But for now, the books are closed and the fire is fading. We have seen how the corruption of the industrial machine could manifest in the shadows, and how a meticulous, logical inquiry could eventually expose the scope of the conspiracy. It was the quintessential mystery of our vocation, the realization that the past is never truly dead, but merely waiting for someone to ask the right, inconvenient questions. May your dreams be clear, may your inquiries be logical, and may you always have the courage to look beneath the surface. The docks of the East End were a world apart from the polished bureaucratic halls of Westminster, a realm of shifting fog, rotting timber, and the constant, rhythmic slapping of the Thames against the pylons. We had arrived in response to the cryptic mark of the informant, and as we moved into the labyrinthine shadows of the wharf, I felt the familiar, heavy weight of apprehension. Holmes, however, moved with an eerie, predatory confidence, his eyes scanning the gloom for any sign of movement. We were looking for a man known only as Silas, a master of the maritime black market who had purportedly witnessed the final, tragic moments of the missing passenger before he had been vanished by the railway conspiracy. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of brine, fermenting cargo, and the cold, unyielding damp of the river. It was an environment that demanded a different kind of vigilance, one where the threats were not hidden in ledgers, but in the sudden, sharp violence of the desperate. We reached a derelict warehouse at the edge of the shipping lane, the structure leaning precariously toward the water. Holmes signaled for me to remain behind the cover of a stack of rusted iron barrels while he approached the entrance, his hand resting once again upon his walking stick. He gave a sharp, low whistle, a sound that mimicked the call of a local river bird. And after a moment, a sliver of light appeared in the doorway. Silas was a man of hunched, nervous energy, his face a map of scars and sun-bleached fatigue. He ushered Holmes inside with a fearful, darting glance toward the dark expanse of the docks, and I moved to a position where I could observe the entrance, my hand firmly on my revolver. The conversation inside was muffled, a low, urgent exchange that lasted for nearly 20 minutes. The sound of the wind, rattling the warehouse's corrugated siding, threatening to obscure every word. When Holmes finally emerged, his expression was a mix of triumph and cold, analytical determination. He motioned for me to join him. As we hurried back toward the main thoroughfare, he relayed the substance of the intelligence. Silas had not only witnessed the abduction of the 8:15 passenger, he had also seen the men who had executed it. 3 operatives who were not railway technicians, but specialized, high-level mercenaries frequently employed by the very ministry officials we had implicated. He had seen them transfer the unconscious passenger from the train to a private, unmarked river launch, a vessel that had disappeared downriver toward the secluded, restricted marshlands near the mouth of the estuary. It was the confirmation of a tactical, highly coordinated operation that extended far beyond the confines of the railway, revealing the true, brutal reach of the conspirators. We had moved from a railway investigation to a hunt for a shadow crew that was operating with the implicit, state-sanctioned protection of a private army. We retreated to the comparative safety of a nearby tavern, the interior crowded with dock workers and the rough, honest noise of the river trade. Holmes ordered a round of dark, bitter ale and pulled a small, portable map from his pocket, his finger tracing the path the river launch would have taken. He explained that the marshlands at the mouth of the estuary were a notoriously treacherous, ill-defined region, an ideal location for the permanent disposal of evidence or the indefinite, clandestine detention of a high-value political prisoner. If the passenger was still alive, he was likely being held in one of the dilapidated, isolated shacks that dotted the wetlands, guarded by the same mercenaries who had kidnapped him. The stakes had fundamentally changed. We were no longer looking to expose systemic, bureaucratic corruption, but were now forced to intervene in a direct, physical rescue operation. The danger was immediate, the geography was against us, and the window of time we had to act was rapidly closing. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the familiar bracing anticipation of an investigation that would require the utmost physical dedication of our remaining resources. Holmes remained entirely composed, his presence a stabilizing, cool, and logical anchor in a world that felt as though it were fraying at the edges. He sat at the table, his eyes fixed on the map of the estuary's hidden channels, his mind already beginning to map the tactical, multi-layered variables of the rescue. He told me that we would need to secure a private, shallow draft boat capable of navigating the marshland's shifting, unpredictable shallows, and that we would have to depart under the cover of the midnight tide. It was a plan that was as audacious as it was necessary, requiring us to infiltrate a territory that was effectively controlled by the mercenaries and their high-level, governmental handlers. I looked at my friend, the consulting detective who had become the silent, watchful axis upon which our world turned, and felt a profound, enduring gratitude for the life we had shared in all its complexity and danger. We concluded our drink in a silence that was heavy with the weight of what lay ahead, the atmosphere of the tavern suddenly feeling mundane and disconnected from the violent, high-stakes reality of our mission. As we stepped back into the night, the docks were alive with the nocturnal, busy energy of the shipping industry, the fog rolling in from the river in heavy, suffocating waves. We moved toward the small, privately owned pier where Holmes had already prearranged the availability of a skiff, our path dictated by the need for complete, absolute discretion. The mystery of the 8:15 passenger had led us from the heart of the government to the edge of the sea, a journey that had consistently forced us to confront the reality that the truth is often hidden in the most desolate, forgotten corners of the world. Good night to our listeners of Baker Street Enigma. The city is vast, the shadows are long, and the truth is always waiting for someone with the courage to walk through the door. Stay sharp, stay vigilant, and remember that when the world seems most incomprehensible, the truth is merely the next, inevitable step in the long, meticulous process of deduction. The dockside fog remains our only cover, the tide is turning, and the truth, as always, is waiting to be rescued from the depths of the marsh. The skiff cut through the black, oily surface of the Thames with a silent, insistent urgency, the rowing oars barely disturbing the water as we navigated away from the harbor's flickering light. The estuary was a desolate, expansive realm where the river met the sea in a confused tangle of reeds, mudflats, and hidden channels. Holmes sat in the stern, his eyes fixed ahead, navigating by a series of subtle, intuitive markers, the shifting pattern of the reeds, the sound of the distant, oceanic surge, and the faint, rhythmic glow of the moon behind the heavy clouds. The air was thick with the scent of stagnant brine and the wet, decaying vegetation of the marshes, an atmosphere that felt as though it were actively working to obscure our passage. I remained in the bow, my hand resting on my revolver, my ears straining to hear any sound above the lap of the water against the hull. We were entering the territory of the mercenaries, a place where the rules of civilization had no purchase, replaced by the primitive, brutal reality of those who operated in the service of the state's darkest, most hidden agendas. As we reached the mouth of the estuary, the marshes opened up into a wide, disorienting plain of shallow, brackish water. Holmes signaled for me to cease rowing, and we drifted into the cover of a dense, overgrown cluster of willow trees, the shadows providing a perfect, if precarious, sanctuary. In the distance, perhaps 300 yards to the east, a single, flickering light emanated from a dilapidated shack perched precariously on a raised patch of mud. It was the only sign of human presence in the entire, vast expanse of the wetlands. Holmes leaned close, his voice a low, barely audible vibration that barely reached my ears over the wind. He explained that this was the holding site, the isolated location where the passenger was likely being detained until his permanent disappearance could be finalized. The mercenaries were undoubtedly present, their presence likely coordinated with the changing of the tide, which would provide them with a window of opportunity to move the prisoner further out to sea, away from the prying eyes of the London authorities. The tactical situation was far from ideal, yet the opportunity to execute a surprise rescue was rapidly diminishing. Holmes began to detail a maneuver that was as precise as it was dangerous, a two-pronged approach that would force the mercenaries into a state of immediate, frantic defensive reaction, giving us the opening required to secure the prisoner. He instructed me to create a diversion on the western side of the marsh, using the flares I had secured from the warehouse to draw the guards away from the shack's primary entrance. Meanwhile, he would approach from the eastern bank, utilizing the cover of the dense, tall reeds to reach the structure's foundation. It was a plan that relied entirely upon our ability to coordinate the diversion with absolute split-second accuracy, a requirement that felt increasingly daunting as I looked out across the dark, unpredictable expanse of the wetlands. I checked my supplies, the weight of the flares in my pocket, a reminder of the fragility of our position. We were the only ones who knew the location, and we were the only ones who possessed the conviction to act, regardless of the consequences. We moved from the skiff into the freezing, waist-deep mud of the marsh, the sensation of the cold, stagnant water against my skin, a visceral, grounding reminder of the reality of our mission. Every step was a careful, deliberate exertion of force, our path winding through the treacherous, uneven bottom of the wetlands. The shack seemed to loom over us, its structure a stark skeletal outline against the moonlit sky. I reached my designated position, the reeds providing a welcome, if limited, cover, and as I waited for Holmes's signal, the absolute crushing silence of the marshes felt as though it were pressing in on my lungs. The distance between the shack and the marsh's edge felt insurmountable, a gap that could only be closed by the sheer, unwavering force of our intent. I watched for the signal, my heart hammering a rhythmic, anxious beat against my ribs, the entire, unfolding drama of the railway conspiracy boiling down to this precise, isolated intersection of life and death. The signal finally came, a low, melodic whistle that cut through the darkness of the marshland. I ignited the flare, the sudden, brilliant magnesium, white light turning the night into a harsh, surreal landscape of stark, deep-shadowed reeds. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Shouts erupted from the shack, the sound of boots splashing through the water, rising as the guards were drawn toward the light, their weapons drawn, their expressions a mixture of confusion and aggressive, practiced search. I moved through the mud with a desperate, frantic velocity, my eyes fixed on the shack's entrance, while in the distance, I caught the brief, blurred image of Holmes moving with the silent, feline agility of a shadow along the shack's foundation. The diversion was working, the mercenaries' tactical cohesion shattered by the sudden, overwhelming intensity of the light, leaving the entrance temporarily unguarded. I pushed forward, the cold mud of the marshes, finally yielding as I reached the structure's base, the critical, decisive moment of the rescue, now poised to be realized. Inside, the shack was a dark, cramped space, the air thick with the smell of damp, musty straw and the metallic tang of dried blood. I found the passenger bound and gagged in the corner, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and lingering dazed hope. As I worked to remove the bindings, the sounds of the struggle outside, The sharp, distinct reports of weapons and the guttural, frustrated shouts of the mercenaries reached a peak of intensity. Holmes appeared in the doorway, his presence a sudden calm center in the chaos, his eyes scanning the space with the clinical, unsparing thoroughness of a master tactician. He checked the passenger, confirmed his condition, and signaled for us to move. Our exit now a race against the mercenaries who had finally realized the nature of their deception. We slipped out into the darkness of the marsh, the flare finally dying and leaving us in a world of deep, suffocating shadow, the passenger's life now resting entirely upon our ability to reach the skiff and disappear into the labyrinthine channels of the estuary before the tide fully turned. Good night, our Baker Street Enigma listeners. The world is vast, the shadows are long, and the truth is always waiting for someone with the courage to walk through the door. Stay sharp, stay vigilant, and remember that when the world seems most incomprehensible, the truth is merely the next, inevitable step in the long, meticulous process of deduction. The skiff lunged forward as we pushed away from the mud bank, the oars cutting deep into the brackish water with a frantic, desperate rhythm. The passenger, a man whose spirit had been battered by the cold, confined misery of his detention, sat huddled in the center of the boat, his breathing ragged and shallow in the damp night air. Behind us, the shack remained a dark, silent silhouette against the vast, indifferent expanse of the estuary, though the distant, guttural shouts of the mercenaries served as a persistent reminder that our escape was far from guaranteed. Holmes sat at the helm, his hands firm upon the steering oar, his eyes constantly scanning the shifting, labyrinthine channels that threaded through the reeds. He navigated with a preternatural confidence, utilizing the moonlight's faint, reflected glint upon the water to discern the depth and direction of the currents, his mind clearly accounting for the ebb and flow of the tide, as if he were reading the pulse of the earth itself. We were moving away from the site of the rescue, yet the danger remained a tangible, pressing presence, the vastness of the wetlands acting as both our cover and our potential watery grave. I kept my eyes fixed on the rear, the darkness of the marshes offering no comfort as I searched for any sign of pursuit. The mercenaries, once they had recovered from the initial shock of the diversion, would undoubtedly bring their own, faster river craft to bear. The prospect of being hunted through these narrow, treacherous channels was a reality I dared not dwell upon. Holmes maintained his focus, his movements economical and precise, his presence a singular grounding reality in a world that felt as though it was shifting and dissolving around us. He reached into his coat and produced a small, leather-bound case, opening it to retrieve a compact, high-intensity signaling lantern, which he operated with a series of quick, rhythmic pulses directed toward the mouth of the estuary. It was a pre-arranged signal, an alert to a coastal patrol boat he had previously contracted through his clandestine networks, ensuring that our exit from the marshland would be supported by an additional significant measure of security. As we neared the final, twisting turn of the channel, the dark, suffocating reed walls suddenly widened, opening up into the expanse of the river's mouth. The ocean tide was beginning to rush inward, a powerful, surging force that tugged at the skiff with a relentless, mechanical gravity. Holmes adjusted our course, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as we merged into the main flow of the Thames. In the distance, the low, steady profile of a patrol boat appeared, its navigation lights cutting through the fog like a series of beacons, providing a vital, reassuring sense of stability. We reached the boat in a matter of minutes, the transfer of the passenger and ourselves occurring with a practiced, efficient silence that spoke to the high level of professionalism involved in our secret extraction. As we climbed aboard, the skiff was cast adrift, its hull already being pulled by the surge toward the sea, a discarded vessel that would soon be nothing more than a footnote in the vast, indifferent history of the estuary. The patrol boat turned, its engines humming with a low, controlled power as it moved back toward the city. The marshes now a distant, receding darkness behind us. The passenger, now placed under the care of the boat's medical officer, sat wrapped in a heavy woolen blanket, his shivering finally beginning to subside. Holmes retreated to the bow, his posture finally relaxing, his eyes drifting toward the distant, glowing silhouette of London that had begun to emerge from the morning haze. He had not spoken since we had reached the safety of the boat, his silence an eloquent testament to the intense physical and intellectual expenditure of the rescue. I joined him, the cold, bracing wind of the river air feeling like a form of baptism, washing away the stagnant, oppressive mud of the marsh. We had achieved the objective, we had extracted the witness, and we had effectively neutralized the immediate existential threat posed by the mercenary crew. Yet I knew that our involvement in the parliamentary conspiracy was far from concluded. He turned to look at me, his gaze clear, analytical, and surprisingly bright, despite the profound, lingering exhaustion of the night. He noted that the passenger was a man of significant, untapped potential, someone who would be able to provide the exact evidentiary detail required to seal the fate of the conspirators in the Admiralty Board's forthcoming, closed-door trial. It was a validation of our decision to pursue the rescue, a confirmation that our intervention had reached far beyond the immediate physical crisis. He seemed entirely satisfied with the outcome, the singular, analytical puzzle of the 8:15 passengers' disappearance, now effectively resolved, his mind already beginning to retreat into the quiet, analytical sanctuary of his own personal reflections. We had served the state, we had exposed the shadow operators, and we had preserved the fragile, underlying order of the city. For a man of his singular, uncompromising focus, that was the only outcome that mattered. As the patrol boat moved steadily toward the wharf, the city began to wake, the distant, muffled sound of the morning's industrial life rising like a rhythmic, encroaching tide. The case of the 8:15 passenger was formally filed. The passenger was in the hands of those who would protect him, and the conspiracy was being systematically, quietly dismantled. I looked at my friend, the consulting detective who had become the silent, watchful axis upon which our world turned, and felt a profound, enduring gratitude for the life we had shared, in all its complexity and danger. We had moved from the cold, industrial archives to the heart of a national conspiracy and the desolate, forgotten marshes of the estuary. And through it all, the singular, unwavering focus of his mind had been our guide. Good night, our Baker Street Enigma listeners. The world remains a complicated, often dangerous place. But tonight, the truth has been served, the corruption unmasked, and the order of things has been, for the moment, restored. Stay sharp, stay vigilant, and remember that when the world seems most incomprehensible, the truth is merely the next inevitable step in the long, meticulous process of deduction. The city will awaken tomorrow to a new set of complications, a new weave of secrets, and a new, unfolding series of events. But for now, the books are closed and the fire is fading. The morning sun rose over London with a deceptive, golden innocence, casting long, sharp shadows across the cobbles of Baker Street. We had returned to our rooms only hours before, the adrenaline of the rescue finally giving way to a deep, resonant fatigue that sat heavily in my limbs. The passenger, now safely sequestered within the guarded facilities of the Admiralty, was providing a deposition that would undoubtedly shatter the protective shell of the conspirators who had so brazenly subverted the Transit Ministry. Holmes, however, showed no signs of the toll the mission had taken upon him. He had stripped off his mud-caked garments, exchanged them for a clean dressing gown, and had immediately returned to his desk, where a fresh collection of correspondence awaited his inspections. He moved with a calm, deliberate efficiency, his mind clearly already sorting and indexing the final pieces of the evidence we had gathered, his focus as singular and unyielding as it had been at the very beginning of the investigation. I watched him from my armchair, feeling a sense of profound, quiet contentment as the room regained its familiar, scholarly order. The silence of our sanctuary was a welcome, restorative presence, a stark departure from the chaotic, visceral reality of the marshland rescue. We had moved from the heart of a national conspiracy to the desolate edges of the estuary and back again. Yet the sitting room remained the one constant axis of our existence. Holmes eventually looked up from his papers, his eyes catching mine with a brief, intelligent glint that spoke of a shared mutual understanding of the work we had performed. He did not speak of the passenger, the mercenaries, or the political fallout that was currently unfolding behind the closed doors of the Admiralty. He instead remarked upon the unexpected, aesthetic beauty of the marshland's structural geometry, comparing the intricate channels of the estuary to the complex, branching patterns of a human circulatory system. It was a classic Holmesian observation, a clinical detached perspective that managed to both acknowledge the reality of our experience and maintain the necessary analytical distance that allowed him to function with such chilling, unwavering precision. I asked him if he believed that the recovery of the witness and the exposure of the ledger would be sufficient to dismantle the shadow network entirely, or if it would merely force them to reorganize under a different, even more insidious guise. He paused, his pen hovering over the parchment, and considered the question with the gravity it deserved. He suggested that corruption, much like the tide we had navigated during the night, is an enduring, cyclical force that can never be entirely eradicated, only managed and mitigated through the persistent application of vigilance. The conspirators would certainly attempt to reorganize, he argued, for their influence was rooted in the very structure of the state itself. Yet the success of our inquiry had demonstrated that even the most deeply entrenched, protected secrets possess a fundamental logical vulnerability. We had provided the Admiralty with the necessary empirical proof to strike at the center of the conspiracy, and in doing so, we had fundamentally altered the conditions under which the shadow operators could continue to function. As the day progressed, the city's usual rhythmic pulse began to assert itself once again. The sound of carriage wheels, the hawking of newspapers, and the distant constant hum of the metropolis filtering through the windows. The case of the 8:15 passenger, while technically concluded, felt as though it had left a permanent, resonant mark upon my own personal understanding of the city. I had seen the reach of the conspiracy, the cold, industrial efficiency of the mercenaries, and the harrowing existential isolation of those who stood in the path of the powerful. Yet I had also seen the way in which a singular, focused intellect could act as an effective, restorative force. We had navigated the complexities of the industrial machine and the corruption of the state, and through it all, the singular, unwavering focus of his mind had been our guide. I felt a profound, enduring gratitude for the life we had shared, in all its complexity and danger. As I picked up my medical journal to begin the process of documenting the events, I knew that the narrative of our collaborative inquiry would serve as a vital, permanent record. The evening eventually arrived, the soft, warm glow of the gaslight filling the study and transforming our rooms into an inviting, tranquil island. Holmes had finally set aside his correspondence, his posture relaxing into the comfort of his chair as he began to play a low, mournful, and intricate melody upon his violin. The sound was a complex, beautiful tapestry of emotion, a rare, transient window into the internal private life of a man who usually operated entirely within the sphere of objective, cold logic. I closed my eyes, the music serving as a soothing, rhythmic cadence that finally allowed me to let go of the lingering, visceral tension of the marshland. We were back where we had always been, in the quiet, analytical sanctuary of Baker Street, waiting for the next inevitable mystery. The ledger of the city was vast, the opportunities for inquiry infinite, and the truth, as always, was waiting just beneath the surface of the mundane. Good night, our Baker Street Enigma listeners. The world remains a complicated, often dangerous place. But tonight, the truth has been served, the corruption unmasked, and the order of things has been, for the moment, restored. Stay sharp, stay vigilant, and remember that when the world seems most incomprehensible, the truth is merely the next inevitable step in the long, meticulous process of deduction. The city will awaken tomorrow to a new set of complications, a new weave of secrets, and a new, unfolding series of events. But for now, the books are closed and the fire is fading. As the last, lingering embers cast their final, flickering shadows, I find myself looking forward to the quiet, promise-filled dawn. We have seen how the echoes of a political obsession could manifest in the 19th century, and how a meticulous logical inquiry could eventually expose the scope of the conspiracy. It was the quintessential mystery of our vocation, the realization that the past is never truly dead, but merely waiting for someone to ask the right, inconvenient questions. May your dreams be clear, may your inquiries be logical, and may you always have the courage to look beneath the surface. The following days were marked by a curious, unnatural stillness that seemed to permeate the very fabric of London. The political storm ignited by the exposure of the railway ledger had resulted in a series of quiet, efficient removals within the transit ministry, a sequence of events so surgically precise that it was as if the conspirators had simply ceased to exist. I found myself observing the city with a heightened, nervous sensitivity, watching the commuters on their morning journeys and wondering which among them were part of the new, reformed administration and which were the remnants of the old shadow network we had so effectively dismantled. Holmes, by contrast, seemed entirely unburdened by the transition. He had immersed himself in the study of early 19th century semaphore codes, his desk once again buried under a mountain of esoteric, historically dense materials. He operated with the calm, detached focus of a man who had successfully archived his recent experiences and was now free to pursue the next, purely intellectual puzzle that commanded his attention. It was during this period of deliberate, scholarly isolation that our routine was shattered by a visitor whose arrival was as unexpected as it was unsettling. A woman dressed in the severe, mourning attire of the aristocracy stood in our doorway, her presence radiating a cold, contained agitation. She identified herself as the widow of a high-ranking official within the Admiralty Board, the very man who had presided over our secret, midnight audience regarding the railway ledger. She was not seeking our assistance in a matter of state, but in a personal, profoundly disturbing concern. Her husband had vanished, not in the public or political sense, but from the privacy of his own, locked study, leaving behind nothing but a series of cryptic, hand-drawn diagrams that she believed were linked to the very case we had recently concluded. Holmes took the papers she offered, his eyes scanning the intricate geometric patterns with a sharp, immediate interest that confirmed he saw something the rest of us could not. The diagrams were a series of complex, interlocked optical projections, a form of signaling that utilized the light of the stars to convey encoded, long-distance messages. As he laid them out upon the table, the patterns began to suggest a secret, hidden network of communication that spanned the entire length of the British coastline. It was a revelation so immense, so technologically sophisticated, that it defied the standard, conventional understanding of 19th century intelligence operations. The widow explained that her husband had become increasingly obsessed with these projections in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, often spending his nights on the roof of their estate, his telescope aimed at the distant, horizon-bound points of light. Holmes listened to her account with a focused, analytical intensity, his mind already beginning to bridge the chasm between the railway conspiracy we had exposed and this new, far more expansive and potentially more dangerous development. I felt a sudden, profound unease as the implications of the widow's story began to take root. We were not merely dealing with a singular isolated disappearance. We were looking at the potential for a sprawling, long-term intelligence operation that had been functioning beneath the surface of the state for decades. Holmes's observation that the early railway ciphers were merely the prologue to a far more advanced celestial signaling network resonated with a chilling, cold-blooded clarity. He began to map the diagrams onto our existing charts, his focus absolute, his movements once again defined by the singular, uncompromising brilliance that had been our guide throughout our many, varied investigations. He informed the widow that her husband had likely uncovered a truth that was not meant to be known by anyone within the current official hierarchy, and that his disappearance was a direct tactical response to his discovery. We were, once again, the only ones who possessed the intelligence to shatter the illusion, and we were currently standing at the threshold of a mystery that would push the limits of our combined resources to the breaking point. As the widow departed, the weight of the new discovery pressed down upon us like the atmosphere before a massive, inescapable storm. The sitting room, once a sanctuary of quiet, analytical focus, now felt like the staging area for a challenge that exceeded all previous collaborative efforts. Holmes remained at the table, his eyes fixed on the celestial diagrams, his mind clearly anticipating the counter, moves that would be launched the moment the conspirators realized we had been consulted. I felt the familiar bracing surge of adrenaline, the quiet, scholarly boredom of the afternoon instantly replaced by the sharp, electric reality of a high-stakes, unfolding mystery. We were not merely chasing a man, we were confronting a shadow operation that possessed the resources to communicate across the entire empire, protected by the very institution it sought to subvert. The danger was immediate, the stakes were existential, and the path forward was as narrow as a needle's eye. I looked at my friend, the consulting detective who had become the silent, watchful axis upon which our world turned, and felt a profound, enduring gratitude for the life we had shared in all its complexity and danger. We had moved from the heart of a national conspiracy to the desolate edges of the estuary, and now to the threshold of an international, intelligence-based crisis, and through it all, the singular, unwavering focus of his mind had been our guide. As I moved to prepare our gear for the inevitable, impending search, I knew that tomorrow would bring us face to face with a truth that had been waiting for a long, dangerous time to finally be unmasked, regardless of the cost. Good night to our listeners of Baker Street Enigma. The world remains a complicated, often dangerous place. But tonight, the truth has been served, the corruption unmasked, and the order of things has been, for the moment, restored. Stay sharp, stay vigilant, and remember that when the world seems most incomprehensible, the truth is merely the next, inevitable step in the long, meticulous process of deduction. The city will awaken tomorrow to a new set of complications, a new weave of secrets, and a new, unfolding series of events. But for now, the books are closed, and the fire is fading. The final act of our investigation unfolded in the cold, expansive silence of the widow's ancestral observatory, a towering glass-domed structure that looked out over the rugged, mist-covered hills of the northern coast. For 3 days, Holmes had painstakingly reconstructed the optical projection network, utilizing the astronomical data he had gleaned from the missing official's cryptic diagrams. We were tracking a signal that pulsed with the regularity of a heartbeat, a secret language of light transmitted across the darkness to a remote, offshore vessel that remained anchored in the grey, churning waters of the North Sea. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered deception that relied upon the inherent institutional trust in our maritime security, a vulnerability that Holmes had systematically exposed by identifying the precise, logical gaps in the subverted data. I remained at his side, acting as the necessary human witness to the cold, clinical reality of his investigative process, while the conspiracy slowly, inevitably, began to collapse under the pressure of his unblinking scrutiny. The observatory was a place of ghosts and ancient celestial secrets, a fitting theater for the resolution of a mystery that had spanned the entire breadth of the empire. The culmination of our work arrived during the deepest, darkest hour of the night, when the signal's intensity peaked, signaling the final, critical transfer of classified navigational data. Holmes had coordinated a direct intervention with the Coastal Guard, ensuring that the critical subverted transmission would be intercepted by a specialized jamming protocol. that would render the manipulated data entirely invalid. We stood in the shadows of the dome, watching as the conspirators, unaware that their influence had been effectively neutralized, attempted to initiate their final sabotaged sequence. Their confidence was absolute, their sense of impending victory palpable. Yet as the Coastal Guard moved to intercept the vessel and implemented the new security measures, the entire choreographed deception fell to pieces. The look of profound, dazed confusion that washed over the face of the signal's receiver, a man who had been the primary, hidden architect of the entire celestial signaling scheme, was a sight I shall never forget. He realized in that instant that his entire meticulously constructed plan had been outmaneuvered by a factor he had never even considered: the existence of an independent analytical observer who had recognized the logical inconsistency of his influence before it could reach its target. As the Coast Guard converged upon the vessel, erupting into a chaotic, loud operation over the breach of the security zone, Holmes turned to me, his expression one of profound, cool satisfaction. He had not merely defeated a political maneuver, he had effectively demonstrated the impossibility of maintaining such a clandestine, long-distance subversion in the face of a sustained, logical inquiry. We slipped away from the observatory, our presence in the building entirely unnecessary. Once the trap had been sprung, the mission was complete. The integrity of the coastal communications had been preserved, and the conspirators had been caught in the act of their own self-engineered collapse. We walked out into the cool, refreshing air of the northern coast, the sky beginning to brighten with the first faint suggestion of dawn. The tension of the last few weeks vanished in an instant, replaced by the profound, quiet clarity of a case successfully concluded. I felt a sense of immense physical liberation, the weight of the intelligence crisis slipping from my shoulders as if it were a heavy, uncomfortable garment that I had finally permanently discarded. Our journey back to Baker Street was a quiet, reflective conclusion to a case that had taken us to the very limits of our combined resources. The carriage moved through the country lanes with a smooth, rhythmic cadence, the rolling hills flickering past the window like a series of fading, indistinct memories. When we arrived at our lodgings, the familiar, welcoming glow of our hearth provided an immediate, overwhelming sense of relief. Mrs. Hudson had left a late supper, the simple, honest aroma of it grounding us in the reality of our shared, predictable life. Holmes took his seat by the fire, his violin resting across his lap, though he made no move to play. He spoke of the observatory affair as he had of the railway conspiracy, not as a triumph of individual brilliance, but as a necessary, quiet intervention in the ongoing, imperfect work of civilization. He noted that the most significant problems are rarely the ones that require dramatic resolution. They are the ones that demand the patient, unwavering commitment to the details. He looked into the fire, the shadows dancing across his sharp, contemplative face, and I realized that this, above all else, was the true essence of his existence. The restless, unceasing drive to bring order to the chaos, regardless of the cost to his own comfort or the apathy of the world he served. The final embers in the grate finally collapsed into a fine grey ash as the night reached its deepest, quietest hour. The case of the Celestial Signaling Network was formally filed, the documentation archived, and the potential scandal relegated to the ephemeral history of the daily journals. I looked at my friend, the consulting detective who had become the silent, watchful axis upon which our world turned, and felt a profound, enduring gratitude for the life we had shared, in all its complexity and danger. We had moved from the cold industrial archives to the heart of a national conspiracy and the desolate, wind-swept coast, and through it all, the singular, unwavering focus of his mind had been our guide. As I moved to extinguish the final lamp, Holmes looked up, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips, as if he were already anticipating the next inevitable knock at our door. The ledger of the city was vast, the opportunities for investigation infinite, and the truth, as always, was waiting just beneath the surface of the mundane. Good night to our listeners of Baker Street Enigma. The cycle continues. The city breathes, and in the heart of London, the truth will always have its champion, waiting for the shadows to move and the questions to be asked. Stay diligent, keep your focus sharp, and always remember that when the world seems most incomprehensible, the truth is merely the next inevitable step in the long, meticulous process of deduction.